In the oppressive heat of a summer night in 2015, a tragic incident occurred in the remote outskirts of Dhaka, Bangladesh, that would send chills through an entire community and etch an unforgettable warning for generations to come. Rahul Sen, 32 years old, lived a life as unremarkable as any, laboring relentlessly by day, eager for a moment of peace or at times the numbing touch of escape that late-night drinks might offer. He was a familiar face in the narrow lanes of his village, a worker striving for something better, gently shaping his family's small hopes amid the clamour of a world that seldom noticed men like him. On that fateful night, Rahul, intoxicated from a night of camaraderie and laughter, made his slow journey home alone. The air was thick, stifling the senses, and the shadows stretched long between the weak glows from the village's solitary streetlights. Rahul's gait was unsteady, his mind blurred by alcohol and the soft haze of exhaustion. But the world seemed safe enough. Just the quiet, familiar streets and the comforting promise of home somewhere ahead. Yet, not everything was as it seemed. Unbeknownst to Rahul, the street he walked along had been undergoing hurried repairs. The village, accustomed to tranquil evenings, now hosted a construction project driven by deadlines and the disregard too often shown by distant bureaucrats for rural lives. Work had paused overnight, leaving deep trenches exposed and unguarded. There were no barricades, no warning signs to cut through the darkness or call attention to the gaping voids carved into the earth. It was a setup fraught with silent peril, masked by the blanket of night. With each unsteady step, Rahul's fate closed in. He did not see the broken line of the road ahead. Inertia, liquor, and darkness conspired to hurry him along. All it took was a single misstep. Suddenly, he was not standing, not walking, but plunging, his arms grappling fruitlessly against empty air before he landed at the muddy bottom of a pit dug for the road's foundation, 2 meters beneath the waking world. The shock of the fall was immediate and brutal. Rahul's body collapsed heavily onto gravel and rebar, and in that instant, he lost consciousness. The village around him remained undisturbed, serenely unaware. Night remained indifferent and consuming. Dawn crept over the village, and with it came the workers, faces hardened by years beneath the sun, their attention fixed on the relentless pace of schedules imposed from above. The goal, beneath what seemed like an ordinary layer of asphalt, a life, was buried silently, unknowingly, and in a way that chills the soul. But death doesn't always come from below. Sometimes it comes from above, from places you'd never think a person could enter. Yet someone tried, and the price was a death more agonizing than you can imagine. Story 2. Death in the Chimney, the mystery at Mr. Hicks' cabin. On a freezing winter night in 2015, in a remote hillside area of Oregon, USA, a middle-aged man named Thomas Hicks returned to his isolated wooden cabin after being away for 2 days. Thomas lived alone in this forest-deep home, where cell service was weak, the nearest neighbor over a kilometer away, and nature ruled in its rawest form. Because of the cabin's seclusion, Thomas was always concerned about security. Not long before, he'd been robbed twice, losing several valuables. However, he had never reported the incidents to the police. The reason? He had a prior conviction for drug possession and was still on probation. Calling the authorities might have raised unwanted suspicions and brought trouble he couldn't afford. This time, upon returning, Thomas felt uneasy. Though there were no signs of forced entry, he cautiously checked every door, window, and even the basement. Everything was intact. Nothing was out of place. Somewhat reassured, he lit a fire in the hearth to warm the freezing cabin. But just seconds after the fire ignited, a strange sound came from inside the chimney, a scream, a raspy, desperate scream, echoing off the bricks and reverberating through the room. Thomas froze. It sounded almost supernatural, but it was unmistakably human, and it was filled with unbearable pain. Panicked, Thomas put out the fire, but it was already too late. Smoke billowed out, carrying a sickening, unmistakable smell. With trembling hands, he called emergency services. When police and firefighters arrived, they quickly dismantled the upper portion of the chimney. Inside, they discovered the charred remains of a young man wedged between bricks, his body contorted and deformed by intense heat. The victim was later identified as 19-year-old Landon Shaw, a resident of a nearby town. Landon had no serious criminal record, but had previously been warned for vandalism and trespassing. Some of his friends told police that Landon had boasted about knowing a cabin in the woods full of valuable stuff, and he planned to pay it a visit to grab something he could sell. Authorities determined that Landon had tried to break into Thomas's cabin through the chimney. Why he thought he could fit is unclear. Maybe he had seen it in a movie, or maybe he was just reckless. But the chimney, built in the 1970s, was narrow and filled with uneven bricks. After dropping in, Landon became stuck in a tight spot and couldn't climb back up or down. He remained there in a cramped, pitch-black space with no light and no escape for hours, possibly an entire day. When Thomas returned and lit the fire, the temperature inside the chimney surged and the flames began consuming Landon from below. His death was slow and unimaginably painful. The incident shocked the small local community. Some felt sympathy for Landon, a young man who didn't deserve such a horrifying end. But most saw it as a chilling warning for those who believe theft is an easy, risk-free path. Thomas Hicks was not charged. He clearly had no idea anyone was in the chimney and had no intent to harm. Still, he fell into a deep depression for weeks. He later said that since the night of the incident, he couldn't sleep without hearing that scream echoing from the fireplace. The story may have ended, but the image of a young man, burned alive in a dark, narrow space deep within the chimney of a lonely cabin, continues to haunt those who live in the area to this day. If you think being burned alive inside a narrow chimney is haunting enough, brace yourself for the next story. Because the place this victim entered didn't just make them disappear, it made an entire community question whether it existed within our reality at all. Story 3. The Frozen Ritual. The disappearance of Natalia Petrova in the depths of northern Russia, the landscape holds stories colder and older than the ice that coats its rivers each winter. Among these stories, the tale of Natalia Petrova endures, etched into the conscience of a community, lingering beneath the rime-frosted pines and along the silent currents of the Kirevka River. Natalia Petrova was the heart of her small town, a devoted wife, mother of 2 bright children, and an elementary school teacher whose patience and smile colored the otherwise gray northern days. In the Petrova household, faith was not merely observed, but lived. Each year, as mid-January painted the world white and the Orthodox Epiphany approached, the family would ready themselves for one of religion's most dramatic displays of devotion, the ice-bathing ceremony, a tradition acknowledging the baptism of Christ and symbolizing spiritual purification. Normally, Natalia and her family joined the townsfolk at an official site by a broader, slower river downstream, where tents buzzed with anticipation and the glint of icons and murmur of prayer competed only with the shouts of children and the steamy rush of breath in the morning cold. Ropes, rescue workers, police and medics presided over the event, tense and vigilant, while participants, bundled in layers, then stripped to simple robes, steeled themselves against the cold. Here, faith and safety mingled, forming a fragile partnership against the whims of Russian winter. But in January of 2022, a blizzard swept in, erasing old paths and sealing roads with banks of snow. Determined not to let tradition dissolve under the weight of circumstance, Natalia's husband, Sergei, proposed an alternative. There was the Sherevka, he suggested, a little-known, half-forgotten tributary a short walk through the birches and pines, a place of hunting memories and childhood explorations, a place far from the crowds and official oversight. The river was beautiful but remote. Its waters, though hidden beneath thick ice, ran deep and fast in places where the land narrowed, or where melting ice upstream pressed against the underflow. Here, nature did not announce its secrets to passers-by. Early that morning, beneath skies brightening with the promise of a weak sun, Sergei and a friend set to work with an axe, carving the revered cross shape into the ice. Their breath smoked in the frozen air as they exchanged stories and reminders of how things had always been done. But in their hurry to cling to ritual, the trappings of safety were left behind. No protective ropes, no flotation devices, no medic's tent, just the cold, the ice, and their faith. Natalia approached the hole quietly, her frame shivering in a simple white robe, a nod to tradition and to her own humility before something greater. She paused at the edge, pressing a wooden cross to her chest and whispering a prayer that, in that moment, must have seemed to bind heaven and earth together into something solid enough to stand on. As she lowered herself into the water, the shock stole her breath, while Sergei and their friend stood nearby, their nerves taut. For a brief moment, Natalia was just another believer, immersed in the harsh baptism of body and spirit, eyes closed against the sting. Then, disaster, that wrenching instant when the world tilts and time becomes nothing but memory and regret. Beneath the trampled snow and carved cross, an invisible current wound its way. Had there been anyone with rescue experience, or specialized equipment, or simply more hands, the tragedy might have stopped at a fright. Another story to tell neighbors about the caprice of winter rivers. But the current was quick, and her body, shocked by the cold, was unprepared. In an instant, Natalia disappeared beneath the ice, swept away with almost supernatural speed. Sergei scrambled to the hole, plunging his arm into the murky, freezing water until the pain cut through his desperation, and his friend hauled him back. Seconds stretched into eternity, and the winter forest echoed with shouts swallowed by the silence of snow. The aftermath was chaos and heartbreak. The emergency crews, their faces tight with both hope and dread, arrived at last, but hours too late. Divers slid into the river's blackness, searching beneath the world's frozen skin with only dim lamps and long steel hooks. They found nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not the glimmer of the distinctive wooden cross. The river, indifferent to faith or sorrow, carried its secrets away. For days, the village was transfixed by shock and rumor. How could such a thing happen? Why would a family take such chances? In Russia, where so many are shaped by a hard land and harder traditions, the temptation to see tragedy as fate is strong. But in the days that followed, something else began. Debate, conscience, questions of blame and prevention. Officials, moved by fear and public anger, quickly moved to ban unsanctioned rituals, with harsh warnings about currents, cold, and the price of overconfidence. Churches urged their flocks to be cautious, to honor the Epiphany not with reckless heroism, but with humility before both God and nature. Yet for Sergei, for the children who would never again embrace their mother after school, and for the students left wondering at the empty desk in the front of their classroom, such measures meant little. Grief, complicated by guilt, settled over the Petrova family like a second winter. Sergei, who once led his family into ritual each January with pride, grew silent. When Epiphany returned, he did not break the ice. Instead, he lit a candle and knelt by the Cherevka's edge, the small flame trembling in the cold. The river moved on, as rivers do. Spring came, bringing thaw and surge, carrying everything lost onwards, far downstream. In time, the story became legend, a warning whispered to children, retold by priests, wondered at by visitors. Yet at its center remains Natalia, a woman who meant only to honor her faith, caught unaware by the river's unseen dangers. Her story is not only about tragedy, but about the need for respect. Respect for tradition, certainly, but also for nature's unpredictability and the value of precaution. The ice-bathing ritual continues in Russia, a testament to both courage and belief. But for the people of Natalia's village, every plunge into wintry waters is now shadowed by her memory. Each crack of ice echoes with a lesson written in currents and in loss, that faith, while powerful, must be tempered with care and respect for the world's hidden currents. So, every January as the Cherevka flows unseen beneath its cold shroud, a single candle burns at its edge, a defiant spark against winter's darkness, and a quiet tribute to a devotion that, in seeking renewal, found only disappearance. To this day, the story of Natalia Petrova stands as a chilling reminder. No matter how sacred a place may seem, without proper preparation and safety, it can become a doorway to the darkest of endings.